This paper being the type that it is, I will read it, and I'm sure that that will be safer than an ad-lib one. I am always amazed at the number of people who will leave a comfortable fireside chair, refreshments, a good National Basketball Association ball game, and the charming chatter of a beloved family to attend any lecture. Some one of those ingredients may be the real motivation for your being here tonight, unfortunately. But you live your life and I'll live mine. There's usually a captivity motive in any case, in any lecture audience. And this is especially appropriate for the subject of this evening. Now, this will have to be given somewhat in the form of an abbreviated classroom lecture in which I will cover some hundreds of years. Instead of digging in depth in any one incident, I'll try to give you a broad, general view, because I find that most historians are as much antiquarians as anything else, and I'll try to avoid being that tonight. As we give due recognition to our sesquicentennial year, it is proper to recognize the role played by Indiana's Aboriginal people. My interest in the Native American is that of the historian, and I must fairly warn you of some facets of the subject which I will not and cannot explore. This is for the benefit of Dr. Schwartz's class. No archaeology, no paleontology, very little ethnohistory, and practically no anthropology will creep into my remarks. I told him after the meeting, I'm sure you can all crowd into his archaeological laboratory at the end of the Ziegler house, the old garage. If you want those aspects, go there and Dr. Schwartz will happily oblige you. It'll hold, I think, 3 people. There's some very interesting skeletons there, however. All of these disciplines are exciting, but I can only direct you to our rapidly expanding offerings in the field, warn you to use his Dr. Schwartz Discovery Form, and pray with him that you never become a pot hunter. That is a bad word to the Indian fans. Most adults cherish memories of their early Indian days as children. Many of you still remember tales of Indian or gypsy kidnappings. Your teachers channeled your fiendish energies into Indian games. And until Walter D. Edmonds produced his novels, the Indians always lost. This, in Indiana's prolific writing school, we usually have a few drunken but noble red men among the stock characters. And I dare say that most of this audience could produce or has written for an English or history teacher a theme or two which would rival Helen Hunt Jackson's Century of Dishonor. Maybe you've transferred it to Mississippi these days in another color, but it used to be the Indians that got all of the tears in theme. The subject of Indians is unique in another way. On few subjects do so many misinformed amateurs possess such a fund of ridiculous information and hold to it with such fervor. I'll merely cite Kon-Tiki, the Lost Tribes of Israel, Avalon, the White Mandans, the White Welshman, Rousseau's Noble Savage, and I'll omit a few more which would embarrass the Scandinavian friends of Prince Valiant in this audience, or any Minnesota native. The Indian in America has properly displaced some legendary figures of the old world. Scott, Costain, Harold Lamb, and others succeeded Homer, Virgil, Shakespeare, and Milton in constructing a mythology. Americans tried desperately to make Nokomis, Massasoit, Cornstalk, Logan, Sequoia, Uncas, and especially Francis Slocum and Will Rogers, into a pantheon of Native American demagogues with their vices and virtues. I might add that A.B. Guthrie, who I believe is late of Bedford, Indiana, primarily from Montana, and now of American heritage, has done a masterly work in this line of debunking some of the mythology. Only please, if you're going to read his novels, keep it for adults only, and don't let your kids get a hold of The Big Sky or The Way West. They know too much already. Some thousands of years before the beginning of the Christian era, men were living in the Americas. They moved with the food supplies. They adapted to various geographical problems. They fought wars with their neighboring peoples, and they absorbed, exterminated, or drove out weaker groups. They were of varying degrees of cultural advance, but there was still remarkable uniformity among them insofar as we are able to reconstruct their forms of social and material culture. Indiana was not blessed with Native Americans of the most complex cultures, but the woodland, Adena, Mississippian, Fort Ancient, and other terms designate well-known and well-defined periods for this area. Unfortunately, not well explored, but this summer, for the second summer, they'll do a little more of that down at the Newcastle State Grounds, out of the Ball State area. More expert research will supply more material and, hopefully, more uncontrovertible clues of their relationship to the Indians who were found in Indiana by the first white men who recorded their presence. Let it suffice to say that some artifacts produced centuries before the white men arrived here could not be duplicated by the historic tribes of India. The earlier ones had more complex skills in some things. French, English, and Spanish traders, sailors, and explorers were probably known to the Indiana Indians before Jamestown and Quebec were settled. Even the DeSoto and Coronado expeditions probably were known in this area shortly after 1540. News traveled faster than you can believe among these Indians. However, Nicolet was the first reached the Sioux in 1534, but French and Dutch trade goods were already out here years before the white men came out here. The Indians knew of the whites before the Europeans knew of the Indiana Indians. The trade goods were the catalyst in Indian affairs. Before these entered the state of Indiana, the inhabitants were probably living at about these locations before trade goods came here. Now, I've used some of the linguistic terms, and I've run the Iroquois one from here on up. They were on the move. But the Indiana Indians, primarily the Potawatomi and Miami, were about in that location. The Shawnee were all over the place. Nobody tries to tell where they were most of the time. These are Algonquian Indians up in here, and they were about that position at the time of the white men first reaching the coast. The Iroquois were on the move, others were on the move. Hyde is sure that the Osage, who had once been along the Ohio, and that the Sioux were down nearby along the Ohio. That's to illustrate how Indians moved. But that move had been made before the white men came. The Iroquois probably were in the south and west, and the Algonquins were probably farther north and east, long before the time of the map which you saw. However, there was a fairly stable pattern, about as you saw it, about at the time of Jamestown and Quebec. Perot and the Jesuits at the Sioux had scarcely begun to meet and describe the tribes between the Great Lakes and Ohio River when the effects of white trade goods brought to the present Albany, New York, and Quebec nearly depopulated the area between the Ottawa, Ohio, and the Mississippi River, and west of the Appalachians. The 5 nations of the Iroquois Confederacy nearly exterminated all the tribes south of between the Great Lakes and the Ohio and to the Mississippi, as they sought to control the middleman function in the fur trade. Any tribe without European weapons could not protect itself from those with superior weapons. Even if no war existed, the tribe with European iron tools, utensils, and wool clothing could survive during winters when more primitive groups failed to survive. No self-respecting squaw ever clothed her lord and master in deer skins when she could send him forth in a Mackinaw coat and blanket, well nourished from a many-flavored stew cooked for days in an iron pot, without changing the ingredients, I might add. The Iroquois plague lasted for nearly half a century, from 1649 to 1700. Indiana Indians were first encountered during this period as early as 1659, but they were not in Indiana. There were no Indians in Indiana in most of this half century. They were up at Green Bay, across the Mississippi, near the mouth of the Illinois River, anywhere where the Iroquois could not reach them. Fathers Droulet, Dablon, Marquette, and Alouette could not have found an Indian in Indiana. La Salle may have been the first white man to enter present Indiana, and he had to take Indians from the north into the state at the present Big St. Joe River at what is now South Bend. Number 2. You don't see many Indians in Indiana and Ohio, not live ones, that is. The Iroquois had an unpleasant habit even of eating a few of the dead ones. They're the Romans of Indian history. But look where most of these tribes had gone for refuge. By 1700, the Iroquois were weakened, and their western opponents, meanwhile, had been armed primarily by the French. The Iroquois still retained a tremendous prestige. No Spartan message ever received more respect from among Greek city-states than an Iroquois belt of wampum in any council north of the Ohio at any time. Fragments of eastern tribes moved and were permitted to move into Ohio, and more important to us, the original Indiana tribes returned to Indiana. During their exile, they had lost bands who had joined other tribes. They had learned much of the value of firm alliances with each other. They had lost thousands of lives to the Iroquois war parties, and they had lost hundreds of people to European epidemics. The French had supplied these tribes with traders, with some Jesuit priests, and with a fair share of the vices of the European brothers, in return for one venereal disease of American origin. I'll add that parenthetically. Yet they were essentially unchanged, sovereign nations with tribal morale, mores, customs, and what is termed modal personality in each tribe. Now here we have two transparencies, I think. By 1700, you begin this movement back into this area with the Iroquois permission. This is the eastern tribe of the Delaware coming back, Shawnee coming up from down here and over, these coming from farther north, and several other related tribes also easing into here, and I've not wanted to go into all the Michigan tribes. To be more specific, here you are. Now, this doesn't occur until 1770. The Delaware will be permitted to come in here in the 1770s. This is the Miami, and it overlaps. This is a Miami division, the Piankashaw. This is another Miami division, the Ria, or the Riatana. The major Miami division is up in here on this area, which includes us. Whether you use the French name Miami or the English name Naked Indian, Tattooed Indian, or Twice Weeds is immaterial. The Kickapoo will come in here and overlap about at Lafayette in that Tippecanoe River area. And the Potawatomi, who were much more a hunting small village group than any of the others, are scattered all over the state. This is the largest group, Potawatomi, but their villages are quite small. These are more concentrated in larger villages, but they control this water. You notice there's nothing down here. This was area entirely too close to the Southern Indian war party. Chickasaw, Choctaw, Cherokee, Creek, and so on. Now this map shows the historic tribal positions in Indiana. From 1700 to 1760, there were few changes in location or in Indian personality in the anthropological sense. These tribes took a minor part in the imperial conflicts between England and France, but these Indians were firmly settled along the Wabash, Maumee, and so on. A few villages got over into Ohio, but not many. These villages and posts guarded the best route from the upper to lower Canada. The English traders from Pennsylvania, notably George Croghan, and some from Virginia, crossed the Alleghenies in the 1740s and enticed a part of the Miamis to move to Piqua, or Pickawalani, as it was called, for better and cheaper English trade goods. In 1752, the French restored the loyalty of this band by killing several, boiling and eating the chief, Old Britain or Demoiselle, and moving the village back to the headwaters of the Maumee, where incidentally I don't think they stayed. I think they moved back down to Vincennes as soon as they got a chance. The Indiana tribes resented their French gift on Indian lands to Great Britain in the Treaty of 1763, but they had learned caution when white nations fought. The forts at Wiatanan and Miamis were captured at the onset of Pontiac's rebellion in 1763. But these two tribes were among the first to tell Pontiac that he could not win and that there had to be peace, the war had to end. At the same time, Pontiac's shelter and protection was on the Maumee near what is now Fort Wayne, where he could expect Miami, Potawatomi, and Shawnee aid to keep him from his enemies. Is that going to bother? If it does, you may have to close. Indiana's tribes soon supported England's colonial policies in the Proclamation of 1763 and the Quebec Act of 1774. Only George Rogers Clark's genius in Indian affairs secured Piankashaw's support for the Americans during the Revolution, and that war did not end for Indiana in 1783. It ended in 1794. The American Revolution on the Wabash ended in 1794 up at Fallen Timber. The Potawatomi and Kickapoo were relentless fighters, and in this case, the Miamis made a fateful stand, one which they normally would not have made. From 1786 to 94, the Indians defeated General Harmer at Kikiauna, one of the several villages at what is now Fort Wayne. At one time, I think there were 7 villages there. They defeated St. Clair at Fort Recovery. They killed hundreds of settlers on both sides of the Ohio. The only white victories were those of General Scott and Wilkinson, who won minor American victories near Lafayette and Logansport. But Wayne's victory over the Miami Confederacy in 1794 and the Treaty of Greenville in 1795 marked the end of actual Indian power in Indiana. Such chiefs as Legree, Pecan, Little Turtle, the Soldier, Little Face, and the younger La Demoiselle belong to this period. And the tribes of Indiana were never a major military threat again. If my friend Judge Annis is in the crowd, he and I don't agree on some certain things that are coming presently. The Indiana tribes had supported the Ohio Indians' resistance to American settlement north of the Ohio. But the Treaty of Greenville made permanent the earlier treaties of 1784, 5, and 6. These Indiana tribes tried to observe the new treaty's terms and were little disturbed by the first treaties made by Governor Harris in 1803-45. After all, they had always avoided southern Indiana. You know that hilly section? Because this was the immemorial point through which the attacks of the Chickasaw, Cherokee, Choctaw, and others came. However, the 1809 treaty made at Fort Wayne brought the white settlers close to the actual villages and hunting grounds of the Indiana tribes and provoked dissension as well as resistance among the tribes. The tribes were a lot like white men. They didn't call them Democrats and Republicans, is the only difference. The Indians, above all, were realists, always ready to choose enemies and friends and causes with great care and intelligent discussion. By 1809, they had begun to think of property and land as individual or village wealth. This was probably due in part to their long contact with French and English traders, which since about 1770 had become even more decisive as intermarriages became common. There was little racial intermixture before about 1770. Again, the experienced warriors who had fought Wayne and had been to Philadelphia were too wise to enter a suicidal resistance. Blue Jacket, Black Hook, Pecan, Little Turtle, and men of that kind wanted no useless suicidal war. Incidentally, Black Hook was the number 1 chief of the Shawnee over at Wapakoneta. But as in all such vital problems, except my classes, hawks abounded. I haven't had a volunteer out of there yet. A young warrior who was not a chief, he was never a chief, expanded Pontiac's Indian state or confederacy idea of land ownership to include all tribes. He was as numerous as the scattered northwestern Indians. When there were 7,500 or so Indians in this area of which we're speaking up through the Great Lakes, there were about 75,000 down in the southern states, 10 times as numerous, and 1,000 times as rich. The greatest help this warrior had came from that peculiar phenomena known as the religious ascetic. Tecumseh, obviously, I'm speaking of Tecumseh. Tecumseh's brother, the Shawnee prophet, utilized talents little inferior to those of Peter the Hermit or John Brown. and much superior to those of the Delaware or the Winnebago prophets. His ascetic, racist doctrines promoted a true holy war, which had tremendous appeal to Indians who had not accepted the Greenville Treaty and preferred extermination to submission. There are always people like that. Among them were not the major chiefs, I can tell you. The new United States continued the basic Indian policies used by England. These were highly ethical and would have been effective if observed. Mark that, if observed. Only the government could purchase land from Indians, and then only if the tribal council approved the cession. No white could enter Indian lands for any purpose without a license granted by the governor as superintendent. The Indians were given the right to remove all violators. Only Indian law and custom was used in Indian land. The federal government recognized tribal ownership titles of these lands, only reserving the right to be the sole purchaser or option holder if alienation was desired. Now, remember my qualification, if observed. Recognizing that such benevolent provisions and attitudes were still inadequate, a government factory or trade house system was established in 1795. This predates FDR a little bit, but it's in the vein. This is the first federal welfare anti-poverty project, 1795 to 1822. It was called the Indian Factory System, and its purpose was to trade with the Indians on a fair basis and, if possible, to drive out unscrupulous traders. The Fort Wayne factory was Indiana's only establishment of this kind. Naturally, traders fought this government-subsidized system by all means, fair or foul. Its most effective enemies were Astor's American Fur Company and unscrupulous congressmen led by Senator Thomas Hart Benton of Missouri. And this early federal regulatory agency was disbanded in 1822. Manipulation of Indians was usually concentrated on personal favors for leaders of the little village band. These were the men who controlled the tribal council. Many of them were able. Many of them were gifted men. By 1815, many were more white than Indian, and that is still a problem among the Indians. The luxurious homes of the Godfreys and Richardsville's half-dozen homes were by far the finest in Indiana. Many of their families were among the best educated people. Rebecca Hackley, William Wells' daughter, wrote a better theme than most Ball State themes I'm catching on my quizzes, I'll tell you that. A half-breed but highly educated young lady. And incidentally, this state and its white civilized settlers, remember, at this time, had the highest rate of illiteracy among the whites north of the Ohio River. We won't go into that any farther, except that it was 7-1 at the same time Michigan's was 40-1. During the War of 1812, the Indians still owned 2/3 of the state. Indiana, when it was admitted to a state, our sesquicentennial, we're celebrating the admission of 1/3, the hilly third of our present state. We didn't have the rest, and we hadn't stolen that top 10 miles from Michigan yet. I will ignore the efforts of the Canadian Indian Agency system of McKee, of Elliott, Robert Dickinson, and others to help regain the Northwest from the Americans. After 1814, the tribes could only deal with the Bureau of Indian Affairs in the War Department. The Indiana Indians' principal penalty for losing this war was the treaty made at St. Mary's in 1818. and you taxpayers had better note this one carefully. The Delawares on the White River ceded their share, their lease, on areas such as that you now live on, and moved to Missouri in 1821 under the leadership of Chief Anderson, whose name begins with K, and I will not try to pronounce it, but it's Kith or something. Anderson died out there and was followed by Patterson. Anderson never ceased to blame Tecumseh and the prophet for their ill-advised revolt, which cost all the other Indians. The Miamis and Shawnees felt the same. They had not supported the revolt. They only took part in the abortive siege of Fort Wayne in 1812. The Potawatomi were a little more active. They were the chief ones at the battle of up at Battleground. Winnemac, one of the three Winnemacs, was the leader against Harrison there. And they also had the pleasure of killing Wells and a few white people and Miamis up at the massacre of Fort Dearborn. But the Potawatomi liked fighting better than the Miami. The Miami fought, but only when it was, shall we say, at least an even break. The Miamis were the chief losers. The wetlands of central Indiana, nearly a third of the state, were ceded, and believe me, these sometimes are still wet lands. They received a high price, but the annuities, I'll have more to say about that price, the annuities were a doubtful blessing at the annual payment. The tribe was also astonished to see their very poorest lands bloom under the husbandry of the land-hungry settlers, mostly German, with big families, I might add. They seemed unable, the white settlers seemed unable to comprehend the joys of the carefree and pleasant life of the Indians, and I wonder who was civilized. After 1814, Indiana paid dearly for its land purchases from the Indians. The grants for canal and road land, the treaties of 1821, 26, 32, 34, 38, and 34 were engineered by the principal Miami and Potawatomi chiefs, Richardville, Godfrey, Topinabee, Pokagon, and others of equal ability. A man who later became Secretary of the Treasury 3 times, the Federal Treasury, once under Lincoln, the first time under Lincoln, said that as far as he was concerned, Richardville was probably the shrewdest man he'd ever had to deal with. And he was dealing with men like the Ewings and Fort Wayne. Minor or sub-chiefs, such as Ravar and Ashcombe, also were the equal of any treaty commissioner. Now we need the one on the session. Now most of you are probably familiar with some form of this map. Here are the treaty sessions. For instance, this section 99 is the primary part that the Miami gave up in this 1818 treaty. And if Muncie is, I can't reach that high, up here somewhere, you won't find legitimate settlers here before this treaty. They couldn't come in and purchase land. The abstracts down, this is purchase, the first one. The abstracts down here are old. The newest abstracts in the state are in this one that says 258. That's the last part of the big Miami Reserve. The federal government could not sell that land until they had first secured title to it, and they could only do that from the Indian tribe. Incidentally, that map and those numbers are taken from the book which is always used. It is Royce in the Bureau of American Ethnology. This is used as the official map. However, in these sessions, two conflicting philosophies were always present and must be understood. Did Richardville and others honestly believe that he could live on equal terms with the whites, but his less gifted relatives must be removed from the whites' evil influences? He felt he could, that's certain. The question is, did he think he was doing his lesser tribal members a favor to get them away from the whites? There is evidence to support this, just as there is evidence to support the theory that he should get all of the tribe's wealth for his own family, and the remainder of his band could be relegated to the unclaimed West in a return to primitive hardship. And I'd cite you the present chiefs of the Miami Indians, and I think they'll normally say that they wish Richardville had never been born. But we won't go into that at the moment. Inevitably, the various tribes split into the usual groups. Those who believed their chiefs, mostly of white blood, had betrayed them, and those who wanted to get just as far away as they could from the white people if they had to cross the Mississippi or the Rocky Mountains. So there you have a split among the Indians themselves. There was little cohesion among the three divisions of the Potawatomi. While most were removed to the Fort Leavenworth Agency in the late 1830s, many fled to the wilds of Michigan, its swamps, lakes, and their descendants still live there. And if you ever go around Dowagiac and such places, you'll see plenty of Potawatomi. I understand out around Brush Creek in that one village, you can even hear a little Potawatomi. You want to go? I know they don't. I know that the Pope didn't give permission to give mass in Potawatomi at Pokagon's church, but he built it, and it's primarily supported by Indians. I guess they'll have to use Lafayette. The Piankashaw and Wea divisions of the Miami migrated to Kansas and later Oklahoma and joined the related Peoria, Kaskaskia, Tamora, and Michigamia fragments. The principal Miami division around the upper Wabash was divided into three bands, and intellectually, sentimentally, it still is. Chief Hale, are you here tonight by any chance? Is the chief here? There you see a hand. Now, Chief, please close your ears. It's bad enough to almost get shot down the road. The Mississinawa band was the one less permeated by white intermarriage than the Godfrey Richardville band, and it was the most determined to remain in Indiana, as well as less amenable to the treaty maneuvers of the Richardville, LaFountain, Godfrey group. In other words, they balked like mules, and they made it stick. By the 1840 treaty, the 10 sons of Medicina were given the last Indiana communal reservation along the hilly Mississinawa from Marion to Peru. The Francis Slocum, Richardville, and Godfrey families also were exempted from emigration. While the migration of the Miami took place in 1846 and 47, it will help you to give some, to realize the extent of our, shall we say, amount of information, sometimes lack of information. This Marion High School group last night, many of them did not know and had never heard of the Meshinemesia Reserve. Every time they go from Marion up 15, they go right by it, including Josina's Farm, and so on. Yet they didn't know of it. In other words, you have 4 or 5 groups who were exempted and did not have to go to Kansas. Actually, no more than 50% of the Miami and Potawatomi emigrated. And annuities were paid in this state until 1881. The Indians always traveled extensively. A Kansas Indian might spend months every year in Indiana with relatives, and an Indian and a family might visit his western relatives almost annually also. The significant factor was this: when all Indian land in the state had been ceded, the Indian menace ceased to exist. There were half as many Indians still here, but you never heard any more of the Indian menace. And I don't know whether there's any connection to that and ownership of land or not, but I've got my suspicions. Some communities had as many Indians after the emigrations as they had had before, but never again will you hear much about the Indian menace. They don't have much to get from. The Kansas reservations existed only briefly. The western wagon routes to Oregon, Santa Fe, and finally to California passed through these. And by 1850, railroad lines were projected. With the settlers on the western borders of Missouri and Arkansas, flocking to the edge of the unorganized territory to gather the tribal annuities, this is the area which produced Jesse James, Quantrell, and a few people like that. With no government of any kind west of Missouri and Arkansas except a superintendent at St. Louis and a half a dozen agents in all of the area west of there, with the Missouri and Rocky Mountain Fur Brigades passing through their lands annually, the eastern immigrants from here were in a worse state than they had been in Logansport, Peru, Marion, or even Muncie. They had white settlers on one side, but a great danger had been added to the situation. They had developed the idea of racial consciousness, feeling they were secure with their brother red men. Unfortunately, the brother red men were called Pawnee, Cheyenne, and Sioux. And the universal sign language for Sioux is this: it's a tribe that never scalped. They took the whole head. And when you pulled a Godfrey, or shall we, not a Godfrey, oh heavens no. When you pulled an Indiana Indian who had had some schooling out and stuck him on the Kansas prairie, he just wasn't too well prepared at first to meet those attacks of what we call the Plains Indians. The Delaware group, which had first gone to Missouri, soon solved this dilemma. They became warriors again, mostly as army scouts, later many as outlaws and as buffalo hunters. The worst commandeered group in the West for quite a while was a group called the Delaware Band on the Arkansas. I don't know how many of them were from Muncie, how many from Noblesville, how many from Anderson, but there were white, red, green, and every other color in the group. It was an outlaw group, a bad one, but somehow, and you can guess how, it got the name of the Delaware Band of Outlaws. And it operated on the Texas border, and if you can be tough there in those days, you were really tough. Even the Sac, Fox, and Potawatomi in the 1830s could defend themselves from 10 times their own number of the Plains Indians when the Plains Indians were still using bows and arrows. But the Miami in 1847 found even something worse than the Cheyenne. The Kansas, Nebraska, the soul, and the Constitution of Kansas. They did their best to avoid John Brown and his opposite numbers and moved as fast as they could out of the first location to another Kansas location on another river. Now, it is well to be brief at this point. About half of the Miami, a quarter of the Potawatomi, and a few Delaware remained in Indiana. They had no actual legal status in the state. They remained federal charges. But to the federal government, their tribal councils, with which the federal government communicated had gone west. The tribes had gone west. So the ones remaining here had no machinery by which they could communicate with the federal government except in annuity payments. Two or three solutions are possible here. Many Indians crossed the color line by swearing they were of whatever degree of white ancestry, usually about a half or three-quarter, it took to give them the right of white citizenship. Unfortunately, that also made them the subject of state law, which wasn't always an unmixed blessing in the state of Indiana. Made you subject to jury duty and a few things like that, including taxes. You've heard of taxes. A more satisfactory system was the friendship of one or more true friends of the Indians, and there were a few. I would put number one as Alexis Coquillard of South Bend. Until his death in 1855, Coquillard served as guardian, patron, godfather, legal advisor, and in every other possible capacity among the Potawatomi. Look in the Notre Dame baptismal, marriage, and other records. And you just could practically not have a religious ceremony with a Potawatomi in Chicago, Logansport, Fort Wayne, anywhere, except Alexis Coquillard was one of the participants. There were a few others. John Roach and Huntington did a pretty fair job in most respects, primarily through the courts of chancery. By these means, the Indian could still retain his federal annuity, protect his fee-patented land rights, and escape state law, because he remained subject to his own tribal law, with only a few treaty variations. And incidentally, that passed out of existence as recently as 1907. The last time an Indian law, let us say, was the law of the land in any part of the continental United States was in the eastern half of Oklahoma in 1907. There was a completely Indian state in the western part of Oklahoma until about the 1890s, with a constitution, a government, and everything else. Now, here are the names which among the Indians count. Some of these are rogues and scoundrels. Some of them are the fathers of Taylor University, Notre Dame University, and so on. You may live in a city such as Logansport, in which all the old section perpetuates those names. These are the traders, and this merchant trader class is the basis of your Indiana community. Up at the top, for Coquillard, you can see. When they organized St. Joe County, Taylor there had to hold 4 county offices. He was one of the Indian guardians incidentally. Goldsmith Gilbert was a hired hand of the Ewing brothers. So was the man who founded Marion. Practically every major city in this part of the state was founded by a trader sent out from Fort Wayne by either the Ewings or by Samuel Hannah. Hannah ran out of brother-in-laws. He sent a brother or somebody else and started a city. And there they still are. These are the backbone of the early part. Their fortunes, their money, their land, everything else comes from their early trade with the Indians. And I might say that in that horrible day of bad currency, the only good money on the frontier was Indian money. If an annuity payment was $5,000, that was exactly 1 keg of 50-cent or 100-cent silver coin. An Indian didn't take paper money. If it was $200,000, then it took a wagon load or two. But it was all kegged, it was all bright, freshly minted, either dollars or half dollars. Now, as to how long the Indian kept it, that's a different story. But here are your men who started the state, and their start comes from the Indians themselves, from their treaties, from their payments, from their friendships. Some, as I say, are rogues and scoundrels, but up there is Bailey, who translated the Bible into Potawatomi and was more a Potawatomi missionary than he was a trader, and one of his half-breed daughters became the first president of St. Mary's of the Wood at Terre Haute. And you can go on and on. I don't have a La Framboise. One of them became a president of the United States, sister-in-law. Period. These traders are cheap people. A third form of change among the Indians came from the schools, usually church-directed. No dirt hill farmer was ever more aghast at the return of his big man on the campus son from 4 years on you-know-what campus than Chief Richardville when he went down to the Choctaw Academy in Kentucky to discover why Dean, I forget his name over here, had kicked out his two very bright sons. But they were typical college students. And Richardville went down to find out why. The Choctaw Academy had booted the boys out. They had been to the, what's that establishment out on 32? Anyway, the boys got sent back to Fort Wayne. The Indian asked for education, and like your father, when he saw the product at the end of 4 years, he says, I wasted my money. The Indian schools were tougher than a province chairman whose campus chapter has just been placed on 3 years social and academic probation. It's unbelievable to see to what they subjected these poor little Indian kids. And they were from a highly permissive social order in which nobody ever said no or spanked an Indian child. Then you toss him into a missionary school, and you sometimes warped his little personality, believe me. Such schools were no solution for any civilizing task among the Indians. Greek and Latin was not necessarily a requirement, although some of the minister teachers thought it was for the Indians. They might have succeeded among the wise, old, crippled-up warriors, but not among the young children who grew up in that permissive atmosphere of the Indian family. The most common form of assimilation came, as it has in all times and all places, from intermarriage of the attractive young lady to a white man. It's much easier to go up that social ladder for the pretty girl than it is for the boy, I've heard. If her father owned a large tract of land, it was even better. And no one quarreled with the right of the children of this marriage to white status. Your Indiana classroom today, if you are a public school teacher, contains hundreds of proud descendants of such marriages, third, fourth, fifth, sixth generation. After all, only LaFountain could build Notre Dame in the 1840s. Richardville was the richest man in Indiana. Pokagon built the Catholic Church for his neighbors, only to name a few. Godfrey is probably the only man in Indiana who had Turkish rugs on the floor and had the most slaves of any man in Indiana. He was only the second richest man. These are the people of this time. The Indians had made their greatest contribution to the state from 1795 to 1840. The dirt poor settler and the overextended merchant had no money, or almost valueless paper money. The Indian treaties and annuities brought bonanzas of silver $1.50, which were transferred to white pockets in a very few days. Indiana products, Indiana prospects, the Indiana future, was always predicated on these payments of real money. And have any of you GIs already started to spend that first June check on your summer education? I think some of you have. Not a single town north of Vincennes in the 1809 10 o'clock line, but owes first its location and then its mortgage existence and growth to the federal bounty to the Indians. As to cruelty and bigotry, that is always with us. Now, I've mentioned a few scalping parties, only a few. I could describe a few tortures on both sides. We don't need that at the moment. But I seem to remember that we had pretty general slavery in the United States in the 1840s. That the Indian chiefs often had slaves, usually Pawnees from the west. The notorious Delaware-Miami murders near Pendleton gave us the only example of legal retribution on white murderers of Indians. There should have been dozens more. But, by the way, have they recently punished the murders of Mrs. Louisa or of Medgar Evers? I haven't heard of that yet either. I don't think times change. History doesn't repeat itself, but it has a remarkable tendency to have some similarities. The Indians were effectively, but not systematically, degraded and exploited. So were the factory workers of this period, the mill workers, the orphans, the social misfits, even the debtors of the time. The Indians of Indiana had no Dorothea Dix to help them, no Francis Wright, or Robert Dale Owen, or Susan B. Anthony, and they needed one. They had one pretty close. He was Isaac McCoy, a Baptist preacher, but he went west and tried to save all the Indians, and ended up he didn't save many. He should have stuck to a little smaller area. George Dewey Harmon has properly said the government's aims for the Indians were, almost without exception, well-meaning, but too often in the hands of venal men. And you married women in here know that all men are that. Who always flock to areas of easy picking. Most men at the top, that is the Secretaries of War, Interior, the Superintendents, the Commissioners, such as John C. Calhoun, Lewis Cass, and William Clark, had the trust of the Indians and had the best interest of the Indians at heart. Calhoun was one of the best. But such men are ineffectual against the inroads of millions of men of self-centered principles, and I wonder if that ugly American included you. You weren't there, were you? It does in some people's minds. Federal treaty negotiations with sovereign but dependent nations was an obvious fiction by 1871, and the treaty system was ended in that year. Since then, congressional acts, usually in appropriation bills, has been the system used for handling Indian affairs. It was in the same year that the last Indiana reservation was divided, or as the term is used, allotted in severalty among the Missinamizia brothers. The same allotment process had been going on in Kansas since 1854, but in 1867, as many of the western band of Miamis as wanted to do so moved to the Quapaw Agency, composed of 6 separate little tribal fragments in northeast Oklahoma, right where you hook on to the Will Rogers Highway off of 66 at Miami. They were out of the path of westward migration. They were hid behind the Ozarks. The Potawatomi who moved to Oklahoma went farther west. A part of the Delaware united with the Cherokee. The rest of the Delaware are scattered heavens only knows where, even some in Canada. But at every move, at least 50% did not move. One of my problems at the present time is to find out why 3 little groups of Miami Indians are now living on rancherias on the Hoopa Reservation with the Yurok tribe in Humboldt County, the northernmost county in California, which is a heck of a place to find Indiana Miami Indians. I rode out to superintendent and said, how come, tell me, and so on. He said, just give me the name of one and I'll send you all the information. Which probably means I'll have to drive out. Federal policy in Indian affairs usually coincided with national political policy. The allotment policies of the 1870s, the termination policies of the 19-teens, the 1924 Citizenship Act, the tribal identity policies of the 1930s, in the Reorganization Acts of primarily 1934. The transfer of Indian land from federal to state jurisdiction since 1950 have all been important. In 1939, tribes were encouraged to incorporate, draw up constitutions, and perform business functions in the name of its members. This is essential. It is in this area that the U.S. today serves the Indians best in business functions. The chief is usually a board chairman of a legal entity which can sue and be sued. And as such, Chief, how many trips have you had to make to Washington, D.C.? Or to the lawyer? Not as the chief of an Indian, but as a business agent of a tribe of incorporated Indians. Isn't that correct, Mr. Hale? The Creek chief told me he'd been there 32 times and was getting tired of the place. Mr. Hale is especially proud of a few in which a congressman's arms are always around him. He carries votes. The most highly publicized policy, of course, is the establishment of a separate court, that of the Indians Claims Commission in 1946. This court has the power to investigate, hear, and adjudicate. The only catch is Congress must appropriate the money. The last word I had, well over 350 cases, were before the court. Many have been decided, including that of the Miamis, and these are not duplicates. These are just the number that it takes to present the various arguments, decisions, and so on, whereby the court says the Western and Indiana Miami have what, approximately $5 million coming? About $5 million? $4,600,000. This is one case out of the 350. The only thing is that money hasn't come yet because Congress has not quite gotten the job done. What happens is this. Congress usually has used its power to tease or whip in line the Indian vote. One house approves it, and it goes over to the next session. That sort of thing. That's close, but that's not money in the bank. The chief one day told me he'd been a lifelong something political party, but he's getting darn close to change. He's been teased since 1950 on this particular thing. Indiana's legislators have all been diligent. I think you'll testify that most of our congressmen have worked very hard. Maybe especially that one who says he's part Delaware. But not 1 cent in the bank, but it's been worth a lot in publicity, because every once in a while the newspaper will run the Miamis have just received notice that they will very shortly get $4.5 million. Well, that started in 1950. It's almost an annual occurrence. It hasn't got here yet. Some of those boys have been spending it faster than the king. Genealogy is a vital concern to the Indian. Formerly, it determined his clan loyalties, therefore all his kinships, including the taboos against incest. In another form and system, such as that of today, it determines his inheritance of any, if any, especially now in federal cases, sometimes known as pie in the sky. All facetiousness aside, the Indians' claims decisions have been exceedingly fair, I think, certainly very well intentioned, an excellent piece of public policy. It's too bad it's been delayed. It's only public policy. You don't wait that long to say you're sorry. And that is about what it is. Now, I have another point or two. We have quite a bit of Indian history taught in the lower grades. Unfortunately, sometimes some of it is of Lowe's a poor Indian type. I object to that. I think that they should be treated somewhat differently. There's the romance, there's the American legend, the American myth, the romantic period, justices, injustices, and so on. But we also have had Indians who have made their marks in other forms. Now let's see, the president of Phillips 66 is the Cherokee head chief, I think. One of the Creek lawyers has 3 PhDs and JDs, all from Eastern Ivy League colleges. The one Creek chief told me he didn't have much money, he was comparatively poor. I think he said he had $2 million. Most of this was not inherited, and this isn't Osage oil land. These are just some Oklahoma boys who knew how to get along. There's always Maria Tall Chief to think of too, remember. The western chief of the chief of the western Miami was here this winter. He was rather surprised that here we treat Indians as something past and gone. Because where he comes from, about everybody you talk to is some kind of a part Indian and proud of. As he said, you may never have seen one with red cheeks and blue eyes before, but that's me. And he is a chief. Now, I'll not bore you with further details. The paper's already too long and too vague. Let me conclude by giving a few points. Whenever you read with horror of the drunken, bloody brawls which took place at Fort Wayne and Huntington, and they did, just check your own ancestors' social life as it was depicted in the Paston Rolls in England, and you of proud English ancestry may have come from that area, or your ancestors in London of the 1770s, or your ancestors who proudly claimed to come from Ireland, where I doubt if there was anything except a mud floor in the whole country when your ancestor left it. The shacks of the lowland cotters in Scotland, the survival of the superstitions of the old people who get you, surviving from pre-Christian times even today in the French Alps, in Italy, in Scandinavia, and such places. By the way, how many unsolved murders were there during the 1930s in Indiana and the various labor disputes? I seem to remember the word 16. I may be wrong. Do not hold up your hands in horror at an annuity brawl, at an Indian annuity payment. Hang around some factory for the second shift on the night they pay. It'll be lots more fun, believe me. Now, I have in addition brought many things which I'm sure you would not want to see. However, this machine won't show these. I don't have time. I've kept you way too long. I will say that in this stack, here are all the legal papers on one case out of hundreds. I have here a negative photostat which lists the Miamis of Indiana, presumably eligible to receive shares in that award, and quite a few are in Delaware County. What's the total? Around 400? 410 in Indiana alone. I have another one of the Miami individuals who were exempted from emigration by the 1840 treaty, by families including their age. Another photostat of a Miami alphabet. I have not yet been able to find out who made it up. Somewhat similar to the Shawnee, it's one of the great Algonquin linguistic families. I have another list of the Western Miami tribe members, dated 1943 to 317 of that. The census of the Indiana Miamis of 1900. One of my nieces recently said, "Will you check and see if my grandpa's on that?" And he is. This book is the 1953 report of a committee in Congress on the state of all Indian affairs in 1952. You're lucky. When they did the same thing in 1928, it came out of 28 volumes. But the information's here. This book's hard to find, I might say. I'd like to find one myself. That's the library. I have here a copy of the Mashingamesia Reserve. I think you might be interested in seeing from a long distance this little document here. This one says that Mr. Hale is the duly elected chief of the Miami Indians of Indiana, and underneath it are the signatures of the various members of the different clans. This is a positive photostat. I don't think you'll get the original from the chief. He likes that one. And once more, let me repeat that the part of Indian history, the part which so many of you, such as Mr. Moore and others who especially have worked with Boy Scouts, those of you who are elementary teachers who've had to deal with other aspects of Indian history, we have an increasing number of anthropology classes. We have an archaeological laboratory. There's going to be a group digging in the prehistoric, I hope prehistoric part of the Newcastle State Hospital grounds. And the Indian in Indiana is not a dead subject. And if you're a teacher, you probably have one or two kids in your class who are quite proud that they've got at least one Indian ancestor. Thank you very much.